So if you look through the PowerPoint that I posted, you can see that I also posted a list of these holidays with a kind of more detail thinking about what these days are to help you keep track of everything. You can see that I discuss things like Passover. We read a lot about Passover, also a drinking holiday, that you can see that there are 4 cups of wine that people consume, but there's a 5th cup of wine that's for this kind of last verse that from Exodus that's commemorated, and it's set aside for the prophet Elijah. Elijah is associated with kind of Elijah will come back to earth before the Messiah comes. And that unconsumed, at least ritually unconsumed, like everybody's dad or mom drinks it as soon as the ritual's over. But ritually, it's left for Elijah. Where does it go afterwards? But ritually, it's left for Elijah. And this is because of an idea that liberation isn't complete. So that final verse, I'll bring you into the land, really represents something like total liberation, a messianic era. And that's just not really where we seem to be in the world in terms of how Jews understand the Passover ritual. Then you can go through, you can look at some other pictures of things, some elements of Passover, the famous matzah, the unleavened bread that's eaten, but then also the Seder plate. So I've explained these different elements, and you can see that as part of the Passover plate, there is included a shank bone. So this would really kind of, it's not eaten. It's the only thing on the plate that people don't eat, and it helps commemorate the sacrifice that would have taken place on Passover or the Hebrew Pesach, the sacrifice that would have taken place in the temple. So it's a way of remembering the temple, but not necessarily performing that sacrifice anymore, not literally, right? And so then there's other ways, of course, that we've talked about how people understand sacrifice. Then I just note a couple of other things that tend to be important to many people. Eggs are eaten. If you notice, there's eggs eaten at Passover, there's eggs eaten at Easter, right? Eggs and spring seem to go together, new life being born, although eggs, are we eating the new life? Some things are confusing in this world. But in general, it's also in Judaism, eggs are eaten by mourners after a funeral. So there's still this idea of both celebrating and mourning the loss of the temple. Why eat eggs at a funeral? Generally, there's a lot of round foods consumed in Judaism for mourning, and so eggs are round. And morning. I don't know. This is how it is. But then another one that is discussed in the chapter we read has to do with the orange on the Seder plate. And so there's a scholar and theologian. Her name is Susanna Heschel. Some of you may have heard her speak at Lafayette a couple of years ago. She's a professor at Dartmouth University. Her father was actually one of the most famous Jewish American theologians, Abraham Joshua Heschel, but she's really a strong theologian in her own right. And there's 2 stories that go with the orange. One is that many people say that Susanna said, that someone said to her that women belong on the bima, that is the platform for reciting Torah, the way that an orange belongs on the Seder plate. And so then she started putting an orange on the Seder plate. Susanna says that her story really was that she started putting an orange to commemorate the need for liberation for queer people, for LGBTQ, or whichever other acronym that people might prefer, LGBTQIA, those kinds of things, right? But that basically to say, who needs liberation today? We heard a lot about racial justice. This is one particular innovation on the Seder plate that has to do with liberation for people's sexualities and being incorporated into the community. And I want to say, going back to that idea of history and heritage, that Um, Either of these have to do with heritage, right? That there's not one that's right or wrong. Some people wouldn't do either. But it's a way of thinking about maybe a more recent mythic moment. And what matters is that people understand it as representing a truth for them. That whatever the orange means to them when they place it on their Seder plate, that's what we want to understand. What are they doing and why? In both cases, it's really important to note that it's simply adding to the Passover tradition. It's not taking anything away. And also, it's not treif, right? It's not like putting a shrimp or pork rinds on the Seder plate, right? That it's totally kosher. There's nothing that's violated on the Seder plate by adding this element. And so that's very symbolic of how it's supposed to work for incorporating various people into uh, thinking about the relevance of the Exodus story and the Passover ritual. With Hanukkah, mostly I think that everything was pretty straightforward. So I just want to note that there are two different traditions in terms of the foods that are eaten. So foods that are eaten on Hanukkah include things cooked in oil. So for Ashkenazi Jews, for Jews whose heritage is from Central and Eastern Europe, we would see these on the right. Latkes are really popular. People eat them with applesauce or sour cream a lot of the times. You can see here chocolate coins or gelt that's given out on Hanukkah. And then over here on the left, we have donuts. And this is the Sephardi tradition that these two are cooked in oil. And generally, these jelly donuts are the Sephardic kind of special treat that's eaten on Passover. So both include the idea of eating food cooked in oil, that oil commemorating the miracle in the temple, but these two different traditions have developed different foods that are really popular.